Our guest today is Nicholas Negroponte. He's a thought leader, TED Talk speaker, as well as an MIT graduate and an architect. Nicholas, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you.
I'm really fascinated. As you know, we met last year and we were at an event in New York City. And I already knew who you were before you were going to step on stage as a keynote speaker. And you created this project called the One Laptop Per Child. Now, before we dive into that, I'm always curious about a man of your stature, a man of your accomplishment, how it all began, from whether you're an architect or a thought leader or a best-selling author. When you were growing up as a kid, what were some of those inklings that you wanted to have this sense of ambition and influence in life?
Well, Chris, I grew up in a very privileged world. My parents were intellectuals. They spoke multiple languages. They were deeply European, and they weren't immigrants. They were living here, but then they went back to Europe afterwards. And I had all my life enjoyed sort of, whether it was their guests or the schools I went to or the places we lived, a life where you sort of didn't ask what you wanted to be when you grew up, because you kind of assumed you'd be what you wanted to be. In other words, and there was no envy in my life. I wasn't trying to do sort of better than somebody. I didn't, I grew up, very cared for and allowed to do things like take the New York subway at the age of 12, cross the Atlantic by myself at the age of 13. We were allowed to do things which parents don't allow their children to do today because they're sort of afraid they're going to get hurt or mugged or something. I had a certain freedom and confidence. And the confidence gene that one gets is awfully important, because nothing is impossible, because actually it isn't impossible. It's not that your parents said that. In other words, they're saying, oh, Nikki, you can do anything you want. Nobody ever said that to me, but it was kind of assumed. And because of that, when I, did well at art and did well in mathematics, I assumed that what I would do was architecture. But the truth is that you don't necessarily take two areas that you think you're good at doing and then just concatenate them. And in fact, my headmaster at the school that I went to just before going to MIT as a student, I remember telling him, I do well at math and I do well at art, so I'm going to study architecture. And he said something to me that went right over my head. He said, I like gray suits and I like pinstripe suits, but I really hate gray pinstripe suits. And I said, wow, well, I went to architecture school anyway. And it was at MIT. It was a wonderful department. It also happened to be MIT. And it was the center of the universe for computing as well. And one thing led to the next. And I fell in love with computers, and the rest is history.
Let's talk a little bit about when you talked about they were very European, because some of the things you mentioned, oftentimes when I talk to Europeans or Asians or people from the Middle East, they often think of America is the land of opportunity where we have these ambitions that we strive toward. And you're saying how your parents are very European. What do you mean by that when you're saying they're very European?
Well, they were part of a small group of Greek ship owners based in London who, when World War II was starting to get really hot, especially London, since they were part of the running of the ships for the Allied troops, they came to this country. And my older brother was already born, so he came, and then I happened to be the first one born here. And then they stayed and then eventually went back to London. And when I say they're very European, nobody finished a sentence in the same language. And that was kind of the twist of words, and you would sort of paste things together. And it was, shall we say, fascinating to grow up in a world, and I can only say this in hindsight because I was in it and it was like a fish in water. You don't know much about water. But when I look back, and of course there were books, and of course we went to museums, and of course we traveled, and of course, but I thought that everybody did that. In fact, when I was really little, I remember this maybe with some assisted hindsight, but I thought everybody who grew up in New York City left on Friday afternoon to go to Long Island and spend the weekend, and then would come back to New York City Sunday night, probably listening to the Jack Benny show on the radio. And I just assumed everybody did that. And I even asked my mother, isn't that a shame that the city is empty on the weekends and that nobody's there in August? And then when you start realizing, no, everybody doesn't do that. But you still don't, at least in my case, didn't run away from it. I thought, well, that's pretty lucky. And, I will pursue things that interested me. And if I had the privilege to do that, I should use that privilege. And I should study the things that interested me, not to impress my parents. In fact, they were never impressed, and sort of went out of their way not to be impressed. It was kind of, that's the way the world worked.
But it's fascinating because they have done studies where if you're in a classroom and a teacher applauses, lauds, admires, encourages their students, they have a much higher probability of success in doing well in school. And they did almost like another experiment where they say, oh, you're horrible, you're not so good. So in your case, even though you didn't know it at the time, you had this, again, in your mind, and I'm assuming everyone else has this, but that sense of foundation, it seems like it really helped you have that clarity. For instance, when I started a homeless youth program 10 years ago at a shelter in downtown LA, worst part of town. I grew up in New York City. I went to private school. My parents weren't well off by any means, but the foundation was there. And I never really realized how appreciative I should have been in that I was never abused. I was never kicked out of my home. I didn't have any parents that went to drug addict. And this had a lot of challenges in a lot of these cases, but I thought, wow, I never really realized how fortunate my life was. Kind of like what you're saying with yourself. You had this fairly well-to-do life, but you still chose to focus on your path, because there's many people of privilege that didn't do much good, didn't go to MIT, didn't become an architect, didn't speak at TED. So I'm curious, when you talked about how you had this passion for art, who were some teachers that helped you? Because you now teach and help and train other people, but who are some of the leaders that you admire that you were able to glean some of your thoughts and insights from?
Well, the teachers in my life that I remember, and I'm sure we've all had a few that we remember, weren't experts about their field, whether it was art or physics or whatever, but they were kind of experts on me. They instilled in me, not through compliments. It wasn't by saying good for you or you're doing so well, but would kind of ask questions that were hard enough to be hard, but not so hard that they were frustrating. So you have to find that edge, and you push kids to that edge. And the one thing that you can learn that I don't know how much of it was nurture, how much was nature, but you learn to love learning. And there's nothing else. There's nothing else you can do. I mean, there's nothing else that you can give your children than the love of learning itself. That comes from many things. It comes by example. It comes by putting you in situations. It comes in many ways, but that's what makes the difference.
And do you feel that love of learning, Nicholas, inspire you to create something like a media lab? So the media lab is one of the most well-known institutions at MIT that you co-founded a number of years ago. Like the whole learning aspect. I mean, first of all, describe what the media lab is and what your hope was when you created it a number of years ago.
Well, I'll tell you exactly what my hope was at the time, and I even wrote about it and said it. And for people who aren't familiar with the Media Lab, it was founded almost 40 years ago. So this is a long-standing lab. And when it was created a theory that I believe is correct, and that is that the future of computers would be very much like photography, in the sense that photographers invented photography. So if you look at the history of photography, that somebody wanted faster film or introduced motion or color or whatever, was by and large, not always, but by and large, the creative users. Whereas by total contrast, television was invented by a bunch of engineers, very good engineers, who then threw it over the wall and said to other people, use it. So these were sort of was in sharp contrast. And I said, well, computers are going to be invented and moved forward by the creative users, not just a bunch of techies making faster chips or bigger screens, but that the creative user community would invent and push and develop the field. And we needed a place for that to happen, because most places had good science departments and good engineering departments, but the education or art or other things were separate departments, separate schools. And to have one integrated place where people could find not just, like-minded, but you could even have it in the same head, that one person could have those properties. And it grew like gangbusters. It just grew and grew to, at the beginning it was 3 people, and at its peak it was 800. And it generated lots of other labs and startup companies, which may or may not be a good measure, but it just generated a lot of things. And copycats. I think one of the best compliments you can ever have in life is the copycat. Copycats are welcome in my life.
And I read, Nicholas, that Steve Jobs was one of the first supporters and funders for Media Lab.
He was indeed. I knew Steve quite well in those days, and Steve was very young. He was in his early 20s. He was going in his direction, and he was doing it with real focus and determination and a balance of curiosity and arrogance that you sort of see, and they actually can mix. But there were many other people. It became sort of a melting pot for the computer and telecommunications and publishing. Sort of the media industries were waking up to the digital world. And so I have to say that it wasn't just my idea and a theory, it was also being at the right place at the right time. And my partner happened to be, this is always a good idea if you get the option, he happened to be the president of MIT. If you want to do a new lab, that's the best formula. And he and I worked together for 15 years.
See, that specific point of knowledge is very telling, because I read about Louis Vuitton. And Louis Vuitton was 13 years old at one point. He lived in a place in southern France. And at 13, at that time, he was already an orphan because his mother and father had passed away. But he walked 292 miles to Paris to find a job. He works with this trunk maker. And ultimately, 10 to 15 years later, he ends up working with the Empress of France at the time. And from working with the Empress of France, he essentially gets all the clients for him. But going back to what you're saying, this podcast is really about inspiring people, about informing people. And for you to have that partnership with the president helps a lot. Now, how do you feel you're able to communicate and convey your point? Because not everyone has that perhaps chutzpah, but you clearly do. So when you do approach or talk to someone like a president of a university, or you have many, many friends that are quite affluent and influential, what are some things that you feel you'd be able to do quite well in terms of making that connection? Because a lot of people always might not be interested in your vision, but interested in their own visions. So how do you feel that you've been able to connect with so many people that have been able to partner with you?
Well, you've got to, first of all, do something you do very well, and that is to be gregarious. And uh, I'm not as good as you are at that, but you can't be a wallflower and retreat. You've got to jump in, and you've got to not worrying about saying the wrong thing or something. And one of the things about a friend, and especially if the friend is playing a little bit of a mentor role. Now, Jerry Wiesner was 25 years older than me, so there was a generational difference. And we traveled a lot, and I carried the luggage, and I didn't have any qualms about that. My job was to make sure that when we traveled, he was safe and so on. And so you could argue that there was a little bit of manservant in me, that I was kind of also wanted his well-being, and he wanted mine, and we worked together as a team, as I did with others who helped me start the Media Lab. But he was particularly important because he was protection. It was, nobody would tell me I shouldn't travel first class or some ridiculous petty thing that they might be annoyed at, because they knew that he was in the background. Imagine driving down a highway and you're stopped by the police. The state police say you're speeding, and then they look in your passenger seat and there's a gorilla. And so what they do is they pat you on the shoulder and they say, "Keep on going, young man." So having that gorilla in the front seat is important. And I hope in some way, at least, that I'm kind of the gorilla in the front seat for the next generation. And don't you dare touch, my junior faculty or students, because my job is to protect them.
That's a fascinating perspective. And was that an intentional understanding at the time? Whereas like, you know what, I'm going to build this lab. I need some heavyweights, or a gorilla as what you would call it. And therefore you were very specific in meeting him and encouraging him to join you with this great vision.
Well, but that sounds like I was selling myself, or there was something premeditated. And it was a bit more by chance, to tell you the truth, that his office and my lab were sort of co-planar with his chauffeur. So in those days, president of MIT had a chauffeur. And when he went out to lunch with his fancy visitors, he'd be walking through my lab with his visitors. And my lab was very photogenic. We had floor-to-ceiling displays. We had touch panels, that were, enormous. We had systems you could speak at and gesture, and even just a high-resolution color display was considered in that era amazing. I even had, you won't believe this, I had a flat panel display. It was the first panel that was released to the non-classified community by Westinghouse. This wasn't the Japanese or the Koreans, this was Westinghouse. And when you walked through this lab, it was about the size of maybe a tennis court. And you walk through them, it was so visually exciting that you almost didn't have to stop to see a demonstration. You could just walk through this and sort of say, wow, I don't know what's happening here, but it sure looks interesting, which is kind of hard if you're doing chemistry or something else. You might not have the same opportunity. But we were very visual. Our things were pretty well designed. We had neat furniture. We had real paintings on the wall whenever there was any wall space. I mean, it was kind of a cool place, and you knew it was cool when you were there.
I mean, frankly, Nicholas, it was so cool that it inspired that movie with Tom Cruise many years ago, right? I forgot the name of the movie, but Tom Cruise is this futuristic person. He's using all these touch screens, but he based a lot of that on researching at MIT, and I'm pretty sure it's from the Media Lab.
It absolutely was one of my students. John Underkoffler is his name, and it was called Minority Report.
Yeah, exactly.
And I remember a lot of, in fact, the various people who visited us or from Hollywood did very often take, some of the visual effects and bring them back and use them. And Star Trek actually used a couple. Various people came.
Nice.
So they cream off something without knowing what the deeper meaning is, but that was okay too.
Yeah. Nicholas, I have one more question. You have literally spoken on some of the biggest stages in the world, whether it's the World Economic Forum or the TED stage in Vancouver, and you created this one laptop per child initiative. So many people want to make a difference, whether in their community, their church, their city, their country, the world. You have. What advice would you give to someone that's watching here, listening to your advice now, if they have this desire, this interest, this idea worth sharing? What would you encourage them to do in terms of their next step to really share their vision with the world?
Well, it's very important to be articulate, and it's very important that your elevator story be short. You want the story out before you get to the second floor. I mean, no sort of long drag out things, and sometimes you have to be crisp at the expense of nuance and depth. And that crispness is going to get the attention that you then need to go to the next level. And I can't tell you exactly where I got it from, but I find myself perfectly at ease with anybody. I don't care what station in life they're at or what role they play. And that comfort is important because they like it. And I had this weird meeting with the king of Thailand, the former king, not the one who's king now. This was all, my goodness, when I went to the meeting, the highway was closed so that my car could go through. And I said, Jesus, that's absurd. Arrived. And the guy was so warm. And he said, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you about how I had an idea as I was coming down the staircase he gets into this awfully, absurd, but, magical sentence. And then, this is sort of the story of my life. Because I really did deal with the heads of state for various reasons. And I go to Afghanistan and I meet Karzai, and I go into the room and he says, should my wife and I have a second child? I'm saying, what? You're going to ask me if you should have it? The point was he was comfortable, and he just sort of asked a question that was on the top of his mind. That's what he had been thinking of. So people have to be comfortable, and you have to be comfortable. Just get used to it. Be comfortable and work at it.
I love that, Nicholas. Nicholas, thank you so much for being on our podcast and our show today. Your advice is so precise, and I like how you pause, think, and then share your message, and I appreciate that. So thank you so much for being on our show. Have a great day.